The last confirmed evidence was a set of boot prints ending at a shallow creek. They were documented during a search operation in the Cherokee National Forest along a drainage corridor in the Unaka Mountain range. The object noted in the report was simple: a series of clear footprints pressed into soft mud at the water's edge. They showed a normal pace, no signs of distress, no hesitation. The prints entered the creek. On the opposite bank, where the soil was identical, there were no exit marks, no disturbance, no scuffing, no indication of where the subject went next. Multiple teams verified the site. A hydrologist evaluated the crossing. Canine units followed the scent to the same point and stopped. In the spring of 1987, a search and rescue operation in the Cherokee National Forest uncovered something that contradicted basic expectations about how people move through wilderness. The incident took place along a drainage system connecting two ridgelines in the Unaka Mountain range. What appeared in the official report was not dramatic. It was simply inconsistent. The Cherokee National Forest spans over 650,000 acres across eastern Tennessee. It sits along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, pressed against the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. The terrain is steep. Valleys drop sharply between ridges that rise over 5,000 feet. The forest is a patchwork of second-growth hardwood, dense laurel thickets, and rhododendron tunnels that can swallow a trail in less than a decade. Creeks run cold year-round, fed by underground springs and snowmelt from higher elevations. Most of them are shallow, ankle-deep in summer, knee-deep after rain. The Unaka Range, specifically, is remote even by Appalachian standards. There are no major highways cutting through the interior. The nearest town, Irwin, sits 15 miles west. Cell service didn't exist in 1987. Radio communication was limited to line-of-sight ridgetop relays. If something happened in the valleys, you were alone until someone came looking. The area in question is a drainage corridor between Iron Mountain and Little Bald Knob. It's a low-traffic zone. No marked trails cross through it directly. Hikers occasionally pass through on their way between the Appalachian Trail and lower access roads, but it's not a destination. It's a place you move through. The Forest Service maintained a series of old logging roads in the 1970s, but by the mid-80s, most had been reclaimed by vegetation. The soil is thin, rocky. The ground doesn't hold prints well except in very specific conditions: soft mud near water or snow. In April, temperatures range between 40 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Nights drop below, freezing at elevation. The ground thaws during the day and refreezes after dark. This creates a brief window in early morning where tracks pressed into damp soil can freeze solid before the sun rises. It's a detail that becomes relevant later. April 14th, 1987, 6:47 a.m. We've got confirmation from the trailhead. Vehicle located at the Iron Mountain Gap parking area. Registration matches the missing person report filed yesterday evening. Hiker was reported overdue by a family member after failing to check in by phone. Last known contact was April 12th, mid-afternoon. Subjects stated they were completing a 2-day loop and expected to return to their vehicle by the 13th. Weather was clear on the 12th and 13th. No storms. Temperatures were within normal range for the season. The route described in the original itinerary was a standard ridgeline descent into the valley, crossing over to the Appalachian Trail connector near Little Bald Knob, then back to the trailhead. It's a moderate hike. Experienced hikers complete it without incident regularly. The vehicle showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance. Interior was locked. A duffel bag containing clothing and a camp stove was visible in the back seat. We're organizing search teams now. Primary focus will be the valley corridor between the ridgelines. That's the most direct route. If the subject deviated or became disoriented, we'll expand from there. Forecast is stable for the next 48 hours. We've got good conditions. April 15th, 1987, 10:22 a.m. We've located a track line southeast of the trailhead, approximately 3 miles in. Prints are consistent with a solo hiker moving downslope toward the creek system. Tread pattern matches the boot description provided by the family. Size and depth suggest a single individual, uninjured, moving at a normal pace. No signs of running or stumbling. The prints follow a deer trail, through a laurel thicket, then emerge onto an open stretch of rocky ground. We lost the trail briefly on the rocks, but picked it back up on the far side, where the soil softens near the drainage. Tracks continue east. The subject was heading toward the creek crossing at the base of the valley. That's consistent with the planned route. At 9:40 a.m., we reach the creek. It's a shallow crossing, maybe 8 inches deep, 12 feet wide. Current is slow. Bed is mostly gravel and flat stones. The tracks lead directly to the water's edge. Clear impressions in the mud on the approach. The subject stopped here. We can see where they stood. Boots angled toward the creek, spaced normally. No signs of hesitation or backtracking. Then the tracks enter the water. We can see one print, maybe two, pressed into the gravel on the creek bed itself, just below the surface. But on the far side, there's nothing. No exit prints, no disturbance in the mud on the opposite bank. We walked the creek in both directions for a quarter mile, checked upstream and downstream for any indication the subject moved along the waterline. Nothing. No prints, no scuff marks, no broken vegetation where someone might have climbed out onto rocks. The water is too shallow to obscure tracks entirely. If someone had crossed, we would see it. The mud on the far side is soft. It's the same consistency as the approach side. Conditions are identical. We brought in a second team to verify. They confirmed the same observation. Tracks lead to the creek. Tracks do not continue past the creek. We've marked the site and expanded the search radius. Ground teams are sweeping both sides of the drainage now, moving outward in a grid pattern. Air support is scheduled for this afternoon, if weather holds. No other evidence has been located at this time. April 16, 1987, 2 p.m. Air support completed 2 passes over the search grid. No visual contact, no signal flares. No clothing or equipment spotted from above. Ground teams have now covered approximately 6 square miles on both sides of the creek. We've checked every accessible drainage, every clearing, every ridgeline within reasonable deviation range. Nothing. The track line at the creek remains the last physical evidence we have. We brought in a hydrologist from the University of Tennessee this morning, asked him to evaluate the site. His assessment was requested specifically to address the absence of exit tracks. He spent 40 minutes at the crossing, measured current speed, water depth, bed composition. Took soil samples from both banks. His conclusion was direct. The conditions on both sides of the creek are functionally identical. If a person weighing between 150 and 180 pounds crossed that water, there would be exit impressions. The mud is receptive. The water is not deep enough or fast enough to erase prints downstream. He could not identify a natural mechanism that would explain the absence. We asked him to consider whether the subject could have walked along the creek bed itself, staying in the water to avoid leaving prints. He said the gravel bed would still show displacement, stones would shift, sediment would cloud the water temporarily and settle in patterns. We checked. There's no disturbance downstream. The gravel is stable, undisturbed. We also considered whether the subject exited further down, beyond our initial search perimeter. We extended the search along the creek for half a mile in both directions. Checked every possible exit point. No tracks, no broken branches, no fabric snags on vegetation. At this point, we're operating without a clear direction. The family has been notified of the situation. They've been cooperative. No additional information has emerged from follow-up. Interviews. The subject was described as experienced, cautious, and reliable. No history of impulsive decisions or deviation from planned routes. We're maintaining the search, but the grid is now based on hypothetical scenarios rather than evidence. April 18, 1987, 8:03 a.m. Search operations are being scaled back. We've covered every accessible zone within a 10-mile radius. No additional evidence has been located. No personal items, no campsite, no secondary track lines. A canine unit was brought in yesterday afternoon. The dogs picked up a scent trail from the vehicle to the creek crossing. They followed the same path the boot prints indicated. At the water's edge, the dogs lost the trail. They circled the area for several minutes, then sat down. Handlers described the behavior as consistent with a scent termination, not a fade-out, not a dispersal, a stop. One of the handlers mentioned that this response typically occurs when a subject enters a vehicle or crosses into water, deep enough to eliminate ground scent. But the water here is 8 inches deep. Scent should carry downstream or transfer to the far bank. The dogs showed no interest in the opposite side. They returned to the entry point repeatedly, then disengaged. We asked the handlers if contamination or environmental factors could explain the response. They said the conditions were optimal. Cool air, minimal wind, no heavy rain since the subject's last known location. They could not explain the result. A secondary theory was raised during the debrief. One of the team leads suggested the possibility that the subject exited the creek on rock surfaces that wouldn't hold prints, then moved into terrain too rough for tracking. We mapped the area. There are exposed rock formations approximately 200 yards downstream. We dispatched a team to check them. No scuff marks, no fabric residue, no indication anyone climbed out onto those rocks. The search is now entering a recovery phase rather than a rescue phase. Documentation is being compiled for transfer to the county sheriff's office. The case will remain open, but active field operations are concluding. Creek crossings present unique challenges for search and recovery operations, particularly in shallow water systems. The assumption that tracks must continue on the far bank rests on the expectation that conditions remain stable between the time a subject crosses and the time searchers arrive. In the Cherokee National Forest, creek systems are fed by underground springs. Water temperature remains constant, but flow rates can shift rapidly after rainfall at higher elevations. Even a small increase in current speed can alter sediment deposition on the banks. If the subject crossed during a brief surge, the exit bank may have been saturated differently than it appeared 2 days later. Mud that looks receptive during a search may have been harder or covered by a thin layer of water at the time of crossing. Prints could have formed, then been smoothed by receding water levels. The hydrologist confirmed the banks were identical at the time of his evaluation, but he was not present on April 12th or 13th. Weather records show no significant rainfall during that window, but localized runoff from snow-melt at elevation can affect creek flow without triggering measurable precipitation at ground level. Another factor is search methodology. Teams arrived at the creek from the same direction the hiker approached. If the subject exited at an angle or moved laterally along the bank before climbing out, the exit point may have been outside the initial search corridor. By the time teams expanded their perimeter, foot traffic from searchers had already disturbed the area. Overlay patterns from multiple personnel walking the same zones can obscure older prints. This is a known limitation in multi-day search operations. Canine behavior also has documented variability. Scent can pool in low-lying areas near water. It can be displaced by temperature inversions or wind shifts that occur overnight. A dog that terminates a trail at water's edge may be responding to scent concentration at that specific point, not necessarily indicating the subject stopped there permanently. Handlers interpret behavior based on training and experience, but the scent environment itself is not static. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. In wilderness recovery, it is common for subjects to move beyond the predictable search radius, especially if disoriented or injured after an unwitnessed event. One detail remains unaccounted for. The boot prints leading to the creek showed no signs of hesitation, no scuffing, no repositioning. The subject walked to the water's edge at a normal pace, stopped briefly, then continued into the creek. Search teams noted that the stride length and depth of the final prints were consistent, with confident movement. There was no indication the subject paused to assess the crossing or adjust their footing. This suggests familiarity with the terrain, or at minimum, no perceived obstacle. But the prints that entered the water stopped, not gradually. Not in a way that suggested the subject stepped onto submerged rocks or altered their path mid-crossing. The prints simply ended in the gravel bed. One team member described it as though the subject had taken 2 steps into the creek, then ceased to exist. That phrasing was not included in the official report, but it appears in the field notes. The hydrologist was asked whether water depth or bed composition could explain partial print preservation. He stated that if conditions were sufficient to leave entry prints in the gravel, exit prints should be equally visible. Selective erasure, he said, doesn't align with hydraulic behavior. The boot prints remain preserved in the photographs taken on April 15th. The hiker's vehicle was eventually removed from the trailhead parking area. The case file contains no reference to recovery. This concludes the record for the Cherokee National Forest incident. The archive continues. Subscribe to access the next file.